Now, what I'll be talking on is essentially while all of it needs to be done, all of it is the way forward, but there is a need for a certain amount of money to be invested. So, what I'm talking about today is not specific to a country, but specific globally. What is the order of money that is required and what is required to be shifted? I think the first few slides, basically what I had put down was that we need growth in renewable. And for this net zero, I would say net zero emissions grid is a prerequisite to even reaching an overall net zero. If we don't have a net zero emissions grid, net zero in totality is probably a non-starter from a direction point of view. Overall, what is energy transition about? Overall, energy transition is about 3 or 4 steps. Step number 1 is to think about electrifying every human economic activity. And that's the movements that you kind of see in cooking, in moving, in EVs, in transportation. Electrify, change, heating, ventilation, cooling, all of it electrify, move away from fossil fuels. So that's your step. And then you clean the electricity that the grid produces, clean the electricity behind it. Yeah, okay, thanks. I think the first few slides, so I was here. So decarbonized grid is a subset of overall energy transition and is possibly the first step to net zero. So we are talking about decarbonizing to net zero entails transitions in all of these following things. But while we talk about all of these following things, it is important to think about that it requires a sharp addition in RE, it requires an extensive scaling up in grid infrastructure, and also towards end-use equipment. All of that put together will give us some sort of a net zero emissions grid. Now, this is what I was talking about. Can I go back to the slide? Go back to the previous slide. You can see those 4 boxes over there. And those 4 boxes is essentially a sequential attempt to reach, I would say, a net zero or a net zero emissions grid. But the fact is, if we don't get the grid to be net zero, and then before that try to phase out fossil fuel plants, no new coal for sure, but I guess this needs a sequenced approach. And in this sequenced approach, I'll come to the investment required. Significant shift in electricity supply mix. I think this graph is essentially not required at this stage because it's been spoken many times over, but it'll allow me to shift to the gap in global climate finance. Now, this is a work that I work for a global institution, US-based nonprofit institution, Climate Policy Initiative, which focused on climate finance. Now, focused on climate finance, we can see the gap in trillions of dollars, where's the gap between what the world is investing in climate. And this is all of it. This is the total 632 billion tracked across the globe. The requirements get into $3 trillion per annum, and you can see the curve at the top. So this is the kind of gap we are facing as far as climate investments is concerned. A significant part of that is in renewable energy. Now, if you were to look at the investment required in renewable energy and associated grid infrastructure, that needs to move up from what we have been seeing from about $1 trillion to 1.2, 1.2, 4.2 trillion dollars. And these are IEA numbers. Very clearly, the scale up per annum is almost increasing the investment by an order of magnitude for a small subset of the economy by 1 percentage point of GDP. IMF talks about a net investment required, incremental investment required of about 4% of GDP. Now, if the world were to be a single country, even then, I think most economists will agree that it's an impossible trajectory that we are dealing with at this stage. Sorry to be negative here, but the scale of investment required is humongous. Now, what we hear clearly is that the market and the private sector is expected to provide a major share of this investment, and public finance would play a catalytic role. I missed out one point when I showed that graph on climate finance, and I want to bring to table one point. If you total up all dedicated public finance pools available in the world and their total capital, add GCF, CIFs, CTF, adaptation fund, add all of it, you will not reach $50 billion in total. So that's your public capital available globally. You can add the multilateral development banks, some share of the balance sheet, they're talking about investing about 30% in climate, but even if you total up that, the amount of public capital is far, far short. Therefore, there's a need to look at the markets. Now, where are the investments happening? The investments are happening in China and OECD countries. This is where the investments are happening. This is where, but where is the demand growth for electricity going to come from? Emerging market, developing economies. And if I were to take large economies, I will add Brazil, Indonesia, part of Latin America, South Africa, India. You put all of them, Philippines, Vietnam. Now, all these countries are going to grow because their per capita energy consumption is low. And if renewable energy investments do not happen over there, and that's not where, then this trajectory towards, I would say, a net zero emissions grid at a global level is having a distortion in terms of the direction and path. Now let's look at what are the complexities which exists here. 4 trillion per annum is required as far as by 2030. Over 50% of that is required in emerging markets. The cost of capital in emerging markets is 7x times higher than that in OECD countries. But the cost of abatement, which means every dollar will abate a unit of CO2 at 50% more cost efficiency than in an OECD country. So all of it give you a compelling dimension that not only investments, markets, and public sector needs to shift to renewable and related grid infrastructure, but they need to shift from OECD to what I call EMD, not what I call, IEA calls it EMDE countries. And how is that going to happen is often determined. This is a IEA graph, which tells you that while capital in the world is sufficient in the markets, the cost of capital of investing in an emerging country is far, far higher on an average, coming up to 7x times than that of an OECD country. And let's remember one thing, that for a renewable energy investment, wind, solar associated, battery storage, pump storage, whatever you talk of, the cost of money is the significant and possibly the only cost element which matters. If I give you some numbers which are modeled out on saying what would commercial investors want, just look at it from the top and see the returns that are required in some countries which have very, very high potential, very, very high solar potential, is an order of magnitude which is probably inconceivable from a 50% return that you're looking for in an Argentina. But it's a whole spectrum that you're looking at, and why. So here we come to the problem of money. When we come to the problem of money, we realize two things. While we have had the last COP talk about a global association called GFANZ, which has got asset owners, asset managers, banks, and insurance companies. If you look at their total 200 trillion, that is the pool that exists, and that 200 trillion, today their investments in renewable energy apart from saying they need to divest from fossil fuels, which is what I was hearing, but their total investments in renewable energy are less than 5%. Actually, a few years ago, it was about 2%. So we are talking about shifting huge pools of capital towards renewable energy and associated grid infrastructure, and to countries which are non-OECD countries, which makes the problem, compounds the problem, and makes it even more difficult. Capital has a strange ways, and that's very clearly that it's the religion of capital to be risk-based and priced based on risk. Now, those risks will get factored in as investors are looking at it. And some of those risks are so-called known, and some of those risks are unknown. And let's call them black swan risks, which cannot be managed possibly. There are political risks and there are foreign exchange risks over there, even if we keep them out. Effectively, the underlying theory and the construct through which capital works is risk-adjusted return and risk-adjusted return over capital, and it goes by capital asset pricing models. And these models, which, whether it is in Wall Street or whether it is in London, whether it is in any financial hub and a center, they would distort the pricing of capital if that investment needs to happen in South America. Now, with this kind of a situation, how does one reduce the cost of finance? I think climate week after climate week, COP after COP, many of you, probably a lot of you who have been visiting, and these are terms which are easily known and available. Public finance needs to leverage blended finance, and there is de-risking of investments that need to happen. We hear all of this. But when I look at the total pools of capital with these instruments globally, they come out to be a very, very minuscule number. Total up all blended finance availability, total up all risk mitigation, structures and instruments available, that the maths does not match. Now, therefore, what I'm thinking of is, and this is just a proposal, that 5 years ago at COP, at 2018 COP, this structure was launched by International Solar Alliance. An attempt was made to pool the risks and some sort of socialize so that investors can be directed to both renewable energy and emerging markets. But that did not take off then. A possible modification is what is up on this slide, that putting global institutions together and the sovereigns together to possibly de-risk in some sort of a structure which essentially works, can be managed by an international institution, but that socializes the cost of capital, because we are talking about a global common cause. It absorbs the cost of capital, not really through putting idle capital, but it could be a callable or a sovereign kind of a callable capital, which could be set up by, let's say, larger OECD countries, maybe G7. So it's just a conceptual structure where the need to socialize cost of finance is extremely important, so that investment in renewable energy flows to renewable energy into the right countries. So I want to make a few points here. Net zero emissions grid is a prerequisite to overall energy transition and net zero. Without ramp up of RE and associated grid infrastructure, thermal power plants will keep on going. Net zero grid requires significant capital allocation and shift to both RE and to emerging countries and large potential, I would say large solar and wind resource countries. And for that, the key points are that how do we shift capital allocation? If capital allocation has to be shifted and the risk returns relationship is not conducive to that, there is a need for a global approach to institutionalize and socialize the cost of capital. Ultimately, what we are dealing with is a global common cause. Thank you.